I never planned on writing this down for anyone else to see. For decades, I've kept this story inside because I was either too terrified or simply sworn to silence. But after stumbling on a few accounts on your YouTube channel that echo what I experienced, I feel a duty to share what happened to me. I'm a retired National Park Service ranger who spent more than 30 years working in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. What I witnessed out there in the backcountry in the early 1980s has haunted me every single day since. I'm hoping that by telling you, maybe someone out there will understand or even come forward with their own piece of this puzzle. First off, let me set the scene for you. It was October of 1982. The leaves were in full color, and the park was crawling with tourists by day. But as usual, once dusk fell and the air got that chill, the mountains grew quiet. I was 32 years old then, a relatively young ranger, but I had been around long enough to know the woods like the back of my hand. I was stationed on the North Carolina side of the park, based out of the Oconaluftee Ranger Station near Cherokee at that time. But on this particular night, I was out near the far western end of the park, in a remote area along Fontana Lake. Earlier that week, some backpackers had reported strange howls and noises around one of the remote campsites on Hazel Creek, deep in the park's backcountry. Hazel Creek area is pretty isolated. You either hike in many miles or take a boat across Fontana Lake to reach it. People familiar with the Smokies might recognize the name. It's near where an old mining town called Proctor once stood before the park was established. Normally, strange howls could just be coyotes, though back then coyotes were only starting to move in, or the wind playing tricks. We do get reports like that now and then, and 99% of the time it's nothing significant, or just a known animal. But these campers were experienced and insisted it wasn't any animal sound they knew. They actually seemed pretty spooked. One of them described it to me in person at the ranger station as a deep, guttural howl, unlike any known animal, like a wolf but much louder, with an almost human-like scream at the end. We don't have wolves in the Smokies. The Red Wolf reintroduction program wouldn't start until a decade later, and even those never really took. And the only big predators were black bears, and maybe the occasional feral dog. But this didn't sound like either, so I decided to check it out. I remember it was the 20th of October, 1982. Funny how certain dates etch themselves into your mind. I left out early afternoon, piloting one of our small boats across Fontana Lake to Hazel Creek with another ranger, a younger guy named Mark. I'll avoid real names for privacy. Let's call him Mark. We cut the engine and drifted the last 100 yards, landing near the old Proctor campsite area. By the time we started hiking up the creek toward the campsite, where the backpackers heard the noises, campsite 82, if I recall correctly, the sun was already dipping behind the ridges. It gets dark early in those hollows in autumn. As we hiked in, everything felt normal at first. Crisp air, the smell of wet leaves, the distant trickle of the creek to our left. Mark was chatting about mundane stuff, maybe trying to shake off nerves because he admitted the reports unnerved him. I was mostly focused on scanning for any unusual tracks or scat along the trail. About an hour in, near the campsite, I did notice something odd. Huge paw prints in the mud by the creek. 5 toes, which ruled out a big cat. Cougars, officially, weren't around, though there are always rumors. They were too large for a coyote or any dog we knew of, and shaped more like a very large canine print. They were spaced in a way that suggested whatever made them was walking on 2 legs, at least part of the time. I know that sounds strange, but I've seen black bears leave double prints that can look like 2-legged tracks when they step in their own prints. But these were different. The stride was longer than a bear's would be if it was upright, and the depth in the mud indicated something very heavy. Mark and I exchanged a look. We didn't want to jump to conclusions. In our line of work, you try to find the simplest explanation. We photographed the prints. This was 1982, so we used an old Polaroid we carried for documenting things. Those photos, by the way, mysteriously vanished from our office later, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We also radioed back to base that we found large animal tracks, possibly an unknown bear. The supervisor told us to be careful and keep investigating. but to call in if we needed backup. We reached campsite 82 as twilight was settling in. No other people were around. It was a weekday and late in the season, so hardly anyone was that far back. The site looked normal enough. Fire ring, a little clearing among the trees. We checked around for any signs of the reported disturbance and found some gouges on a tree trunk about 8 feet up. They looked like claw marks, 5 distinct slashes in the bark. Black bears can climb trees and do scratch, but these marks started higher than you'd expect a bear of usual size to reach on its hind legs. It was like something big stood upright and raked the tree. At this point, Mark was getting visibly uneasy. I was too, though I was trying to play the composed senior ranger. We decided to stick around until after dark, to see if the sounds happened again. Maybe we'd identify it, a long shot, but part of me was curious. Part of me also thought if it's a bear with an injured vocal cord, or something making weird sounds, we needed to know for safety. And frankly, I felt responsible for making sure it was safe for any hikers coming through. If some rabid animal was around, we needed to deal with it. We set up a little observation point on a small rise about 50 yards from the campsite, where we had a clear view of the area and a good vantage into the woods downhill towards the creek. We did not make a fire, didn't want to scare it off or announce our presence. I also had a bolt-action rifle, a Remington 30-06, that we sometimes carried for wildlife control, which I'd brought along and left slung over my shoulder or leaning nearby just in case. I really hoped not to need it. The night was moonless or near enough to be very dark. The stars were out, and in those days the Hazel Creek area had zero light pollution. It was quiet. You could hear every little twig snap, the rustle of leaves. Hours passed with nothing unusual. Mark even dozed off for a bit around 10 p.m., and I was sipping lukewarm coffee to stay alert. I remember the time because I checked my watch frequently. When you're in the dark woods waiting, time slows down, and every minute feels long. Sometime close to midnight, it started. First, an awful smell hit us out of nowhere. It was a rank odor, like wet dog mixed with decaying meat, just foul and strong enough to make you gag. I nudged Mark awake because that smell alone raised the hair on my neck. It wasn't the typical skunk spray or bear musk we recognized. This was different, more intense, like something rotten and animalistic all at once. As we were whispering about the smell, we heard a snap of a branch from the direction of the creek. I recall that at that moment the forest, which had been alive with crickets and tree frogs, went completely silent. The sudden quiet was unnerving. You notice when the usual chorus of insects and frogs just stops. It often means a large predator is moving nearby. We trained our flashlight beams toward the sound, but the lights only penetrated so far through the dense rhododendron thickets and pines. For a minute or two, we heard nothing more. We just kept our lights pointed and ears open, hearts pounding. I could hear Mark's breathing. It had that tense, shallow cadence of someone bracing for something bad. Then the howling started. A sound erupted from perhaps 100 feet away, beyond our sight but clearly close. It began as a low, guttural growl that built into a prolonged howl or roar. It had a deep canine tone to it, but there was an almost human-like scream layered in. Something just wrong. The camper's description earlier wasn't an exaggeration. My blood went cold. Mark let out a whispered curse, swinging his flashlight wildly in the direction of the howl. I put a hand on his shoulder to steady him, and to be honest, to steady myself. In that moment, I caught sight of a pair of eyes reflecting our flashlight beam from behind a clump of bushes. They were at a height I estimated over 7 feet off the ground. The eye shine was the typical greenish red you get from animals at night, but these eyes seemed larger and set wider than a deer's or bear's. They stared at us for a second, then disappeared as if whatever it was turned its head away. We heard movement, heavy thump, thump, thump footfalls, circling to our left, just outside the beam of light. It was circling us, stalking in the dark. Suddenly, it charged. The creature burst out of the brush, maybe 30 feet to our left with incredible speed, heading straight for us. All I saw in that split second was a blur of grayish fur and a towering, upright form barreling forward. It was unmistakably tall and bipedal, like a person, but far bulkier. The head was huge and had the unmistakable long snout of a wolf or German shepherd, jaws open. I caught the glint of teeth, lots of them, white and sharp, and those eyes, which now seemed to have a reddish glow. This all registered in a flash as it came at us. I don't think I've ever felt such primal fear in my life. My body reacted on pure instinct. I stumbled backward and fell onto my rear, scrambling to get my gun up. Mark screamed, a guttural, terrified shout, and I think he froze rather than firing. I already had my revolver in hand. I'd drawn it when we first saw the eyes, and managed to fire off a shot at the charging figure. In the brief muzzle flash, I got the clearest look at the thing. A massive, muscular body covered in dark, matted fur, broad shoulders, a canine face contorted into a snarl. It looked for all the world like a werewolf out of a nightmare, but very real and solid. The shot made it swerve or hesitate. I'm not sure if I hit it. I heard a snarling yelp, and the creature veered off just short of us, darting into the shadows beyond our little rise. In a matter of seconds, it disappeared from our line of sight, crashing through the underbrush with incredible speed and power. The foliage rustled and I could hear heavy steps moving away. Then it went quiet. I realized I had been holding my breath. My ears were ringing from the gunshot. Mark was next to me, cursing and shaking uncontrollably. He'd drawn his sidearm but never fired a shot. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the rifle that was propped nearby, in case it came back, and tried to collect myself. We both stood back to back almost, shining flashlights all around, trying to see where it went. My heart felt like it was pounding out of my chest. We remained there in a defensive stance for maybe a minute, which felt like an eternity, scanning and listening. It was dead silent again. Then we heard a low growl from somewhere in the darkness down the slope, maybe 100 feet away now. It wasn't the full howl, just a menacing growl, and it sent a clear message: stay away. We had no desire to go after it. Our priority was to get out of there alive. At that point, we decided to start backing out toward our boat. That meant a solid 2-mile hike in the dark through thick woods, but staying put felt more dangerous. We didn't run. We both knew that running might trigger a predator to chase, but we moved as fast as we dared while still looking in all directions. I had the rifle in one hand, flashlight in the other. Mark kept his pistol out and was practically walking backward, covering our rear. We radioed in a distress call as we started moving. I fumbled with the radio and managed to get out something along the lines of, "Ranger, call sign to base. We've encountered a large aggressive animal, possible bear. We're retreating. Request backup." The reception in that valley was lousy, but I heard an acknowledgement through static and a promise to send help. I'm sure the dispatcher on duty assumed it was a bear attack or something along those lines. That hike out was the longest trek of my life. Every few dozen yards, we'd stop and listen. Several times, we heard faint movement in the woods parallel to us. The crack of sticks, rustling of leaves, the kinds of sounds that suggest something is following you, trying not to be seen. When we would stop, it would stop. When we moved, it picked up again. It felt exactly like being stalked. I caught the occasional glimpse of those eyes again in the far distance when I swung my light toward the noise. They never came too close, but they were there. At one point, we heard a splash in the creek off to our left, as if the thing was moving in the water to mask its sound, or maybe it was joined by another. I dreaded that thought. My whole body was on edge, adrenaline on overload. The forest was still eerily silent except for our own crashing footsteps and heavy breathing. I remember whispering to Mark to keep it together and not to fire unless he had to. The last thing we wanted was to waste shots or accidentally shoot one another in panic. He just nodded, eyes wide. We both were drenched in sweat despite the cool night. It probably took us close to an hour to cover those 2 miles, stepping carefully but swiftly, glancing over our shoulders constantly. By the time we saw the shimmer of the lake through the trees, dawn was just barely hinting at the horizon with a sliver of pale light. We practically leapt into our small boat. I started the engine, and as we pulled away from the shore, I finally felt like we might actually survive this. Only when we were about 50 yards out on the water did I feel a weight begin to lift. I think we both just about collapsed in the boat, gasping. Every ripple in that lake water still made me jumpy, mind you. I was not convinced that thing couldn't swim or wouldn't suddenly appear on the shore. But we didn't see it again. It seemed content to have run us out of its territory. When we got back to the dock near our vehicle, the sun was just cresting the mountains enough to bring a dim morning light. A couple of other rangers were waiting for us, along with two guys I didn't immediately recognize. Those two were not wearing Park Service uniforms. They had on dark olive drab outfits, almost like military flight suits or fatigues, but without any obvious unit patches or rank insignia that I could see. One of them did have a patch on his shoulder, but from a distance I couldn't make it out. It definitely wasn't any Park or Forest Service logo, nor the usual Army or Air Force insignias I'm familiar with. They were talking quietly with my chief ranger, my immediate boss, in a little huddle. As soon as we tied up and climbed off the boat, I could tell by the atmosphere that word had gotten around fast. Mark was still in shock, shaking and pale. One of our fellow rangers quickly went to him, put a blanket around him, and led him a short distance away, presumably to calm him down and check if he was hurt. He wasn't, aside from maybe a bruise or two from stumbling around. I was a mix of wired on adrenaline and dead tired, but my mind was racing. I started telling my chief, it wasn't a bear, it was, but he cut me off saying, let's get you debriefed first. The two men in olive drab approached me. One, a tall, stern-faced guy, probably in his 40s, spoke in a very controlled, low tone. He said something to the effect of being glad we were safe, and that we needed to debrief immediately. I found it odd because usually, any debrief or incident report happens with park management or law enforcement rangers, not random people I'd never met. I glanced at my chief, and he gave me a nod as if to say, go ahead. So still dazed, I followed these two men a few steps away by the back of a pickup truck, not a Park Service vehicle. It was an unmarked gray Ford, I remember that. One guy took out a notepad. The one who'd spoken, with the stern face, did most of the talking. He basically asked me to recount everything that happened, from the moment we landed on the shore to the moment we got back. I was still shaking and rattled, but I tried my best to tell it straight. The prints, the howling, the creature charging, me firing, the retreat. He took notes and would occasionally interject with oddly specific questions. Can you estimate how tall? Did it actually touch either of you? What did the odor smell like? Did you notice any sounds like machinery or see any lights? That last question about machinery or lights threw me off. I said no, just the creature in the forest. Why would I have heard machinery? When I described firing at it, he zeroed in, asking if I thought I hit it, and if we saw any blood or tissue. I said I wasn't sure. Everything happened so fast, and we did not stick around to examine the area, obviously. He just nodded, almost like he expected that answer. I did mention the prints and claw marks we found earlier. He jotted that down and again exchanged a look with his partner. After I'd gotten through the whole ordeal, the two men stepped aside for a moment, saying they needed to confer. I could overhear bits of them talking with my chief ranger a few yards away. My chief looked bewildered, and I caught him glancing over at me and Mark with concern. I distinctly heard one of the men mention protocol and something like containment zone and we've got it covered. This was far beyond normal park business, and I was utterly confused and on edge. They came back to me, and the stern man said, in a tone that was both authoritative and oddly reassuring, that what we encountered was most likely an aggressive bear. He emphasized that word, bear, and said perhaps it was disoriented or had mange which made it appear larger or different. I immediately started to protest because I knew what we saw was no bear. I said, with all due respect, I've encountered plenty of bears, and that was not a bear. He held up his hand, essentially shushing me, and repeated that it was in everyone's best interest if we just stick to the bear story. He added, we have protocols for situations like this. That phrasing, these situations, gave me a chill. It implied this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. I looked to my chief, hoping he'd back me up, but he just gave me a slight shake of the head as if to say, "Don't fight this." The second man, who had mostly been silent, then chimed in calmly that what we saw might have been a genetically aberrant wolf-dog hybrid. I remember those words because they were so clinical and odd. No one had ever reported a wolf-dog hybrid in the Smokies, and certainly not an upright one. He said a specialized team was being brought in to track and relocate it for study, and that in the meantime, that area of the park would be closed to visitors for safety. The way he spoke, it was clear he was giving us an official line. At this point, the stern man's tone became more formal. He said something along the lines of, "We appreciate your cooperation. Now, you'll need to file an incident report. Keep it straightforward. You encountered a bear. It charged. You fired a warning shot. You retreated. End of story." He looked me in the eye and added that for the sake of my career and my colleagues, it would be best not to speculate further about what I thought I saw. It was a not-so-veiled warning. Everything in me wanted to argue, but a combination of shock, exhaustion, and the surreal authoritative pressure made me nod in numb agreement. Mark by this time was sitting in one of the vehicles, looking down at the ground with a 1,000-yard stare. They had given him some water, and I think one of the rangers was checking him for any injuries again. The two mystery men wrapped up their talk with my chief a short distance away, too quietly for me to hear, and I saw one of them hand my chief a small stack of papers or a folder. Not sure what it was. Then they walked back to their unmarked truck. Before they left, one of them turned back and gave a kind of polite half-smile, saying to us, "Take care, we'll handle it from here." And just like that, they drove off, leaving me and Mark with our regular colleagues. My chief ranger, looking a bit pale himself, told us to head home, get some rest. He reiterated in a gentle but firm way that we should write up the report as essentially a close encounter with an aggressive bear, nothing more. I remember him saying, "Sometimes nature surprises us with oddities, but it's best not to go stirring things up." I got the impression he didn't fully buy the bear story either, but was caught in the chain of command. I was in a fog driving home that morning. I kept replaying the scene in my head, and also the strange debrief. It felt like I was in an episode of The X-Files, honestly. I had expected to come back and maybe be met with skepticism, or at most a quick meeting with park management. I did not expect pseudo-military suits waiting for us at dawn, telling us what we didn't see. Later that day, after trying and failing to get some sleep, I had to write the incident report. It was the most frustrating report I've ever written, having to omit the truth. I basically said we encountered an unknown large animal, likely a bear, that it bluff charged us. We fired a warning shot. We left. I turned it in, and nothing more was ever said officially. The area around Hazel Creek was closed for about a week under the guise of bear activity. For example, there's an old emergency transmitter bunker on Mount Mitchell in North Carolina, and rumor of one near Clingman's Dome, built as part of a continuity of government plan. I've seen with my own eyes a sealed steel hatch on a ridge not far from Clingman's Dome, while out on a search and rescue in the late 80s. It looked like an old underground facility entrance. We were told it was an old communications bunker from the 60s. Now I wonder. One particularly chilling memory. Sometime in the late 80s, I was in the park dispatch office when I overheard a bit of chatter about an alpha predator exercise set to take place after midnight in a certain off-limits region of the park. That caught my attention because I'd never heard that term. I inquired innocently to my supervisor, and he just said something about a trial run for bear response teams. But it sure didn't sound like that. In retrospect, alpha predator sounds like a code name one might use for something like the creature we saw. I can't prove any connection, but it made my ears perk up at the time, and I never forgot it. All of this stewed in my mind for decades. I stayed with the Park Service into the 2000s, eventually retiring. I never had another encounter quite like that one, thank God. But the Smokies are huge and heavily wooded. A creature could live in the remote areas with little chance of being seen, except by the luck or misfortune of timing like ours. Occasionally, we'd get another odd report, usually secondhand, like a camper talking about strange eye shine or an uncanny howl at night. We rangers would log it, check it out perfunctorily, and often chuckle about the boogeyman of the Smokies. But I never laughed. I would dutifully go investigate those reports, in daylight if I could, and always felt a knot in my stomach that I might find what I found in 1982. I never did find evidence in those later checks, maybe just as well. Now, so many years later, I've decided to share this because I've seen that there are communities of people out there who won't outright ridicule me, people who have seen strange creatures, or who at least are open to the possibility. I know how crazy it all sounds. If I were reading this and hadn't lived it, I'd be skeptical too. But I give you my word, as a man who spent a lifetime in those woods, something is out there in the Smoky Mountains that is beyond the normal fauna. Something intelligence agencies or whomever clearly know about and are keen to keep under wraps. I also worry about public safety in a sense. It's a tricky thing. I love the national park system, and I don't want to scare people away from enjoying these beautiful places. 99.9% of visitors will never encounter what I did, but I do think hikers and rangers alike should be aware that sometimes the official explanations aren't the whole truth. If a hiker goes missing under odd circumstances, or multiple people report a bear that wasn't a bear, there might be more to it. On a personal level, writing this is cathartic. I've lived with this memory and the imposed secrecy for too long. Apart from Mark, who I lost touch with, I heard he quit the park service not long after that incident. And the few colleagues I quietly confided in, I've never told the full story to anyone. Not even my family knows the details. They just know I had a scare with a bear back in the day, and that I became extra cautious in the woods after that. They probably think I just spooked myself or got attacked by a normal animal. I haven't corrected them. Even now, old habits die hard. I still love the outdoors, and I still hike and camp occasionally. But I go armed, and I don't go alone, and my camps are always near other people, or in more trafficked areas. I can't bring myself to venture into the deep backcountry solo, not after that night. The primal fear it awoke in me is something I wouldn't wish on anyone.